Hello everyone, and welcome to a couple of lectures that I want to give you, make a couple videos that is, on the philosopher H.A. Prichard. And I'm going to try and give you a bit of a motivation as to why I think you should read a little bit of Prichard, namely because he sits at what could be called a sub-tradition in ethics in the 20th century. So without further ado, let's dig in a little bit. So first off, Prichard, H.A. Prichard, as he was known, this is the part one, this is the first of the videos. He's born in 1871, dies in 1947. And one of the reasons why I want to bring him to your attention is that another very famous philosopher, a fellow named W.D. Ross, who wrote one of the canonical texts in ethics in the 20th century called The Right and the Good. Now, the right and the good, we could say, stands at the beginning of this sub-discipline of ethics in the 20th century, a deontological tradition. And the importance of it is eventually leads into thinkers like John Rawls, who it's pretty well impossible to estimate his impact on things. So we're looking at the train of ideas and thinkers that led up to some of the most famous philosophers that have been around at the end of the 20th century. So we start at the beginning to see how the end of the 20th century ended up. And what's interesting about Ross, W.D. Ross, he acknowledges quite clearly his debt to Prichard. So in the preface of this little book, just short little work, very interesting, he says that my main obligation is to Professor H.A. Prichard. I believe that I owe the main lines of my view, expressed in my first two chapters, to his article, Does Moral Philosophy Rest on a Mistake? Now, I'm going to dig into Prichard's article, Does Moral Philosophy Rest on a Mistake, in succeeding lectures, but for now, this is going to be, Prichard's main contribution. Now, with Ross acknowledging his debt to Prichard, it is the discussion of the notion of obligation and the clarity, and shall we also say the clarity comes at the price of narrowness that Prichard stresses that Ross is going to pick up. And of course, the title of the book being The Right and the Good, it's an attempt to get really clear at these concepts, namely, what is the relationship in ethical theory between the concept of right and the concept of good? These two concepts have been argued over and debated by a number of moral philosophies throughout the tradition. Now, W.D. Ross acknowledges his debt, and later, towards the end of this video, I'll bring up a few other philosophers that also acknowledge their debt to Prichard. Now, as I said, he's a British thinker. He's born in London, Oxford educated, not a surprise, and studied a lot in the areas of mathematics and philosophy. So he was shaped largely by, shall we say, a fairly abstract approach to philosophy. And the abstract approach, one of the nice things, it's got its drawbacks, but one of the nice things is the stress on conceptual clarity. Philosophy of stresses this conceptual clarity, and then again, working with mathematics, well, that's all about nailing down your concepts as clearly as you can. So you put the two together, you get a very strong emphasis that philosophy is all about clarifying things. And of course, that goes all the way back to Socrates, who always asked, what do you mean by this concept or that concept that you're using? Then, after he finishes his education, he worked in London for a little while at with some solicitors. So he worked a bit in the corporate world, but not very long. Returns back to academia and spends pretty well his whole career, some 26 years, at Trinity College in Cambridge. So he's right, Oxbridge, classic British education of the time. Now, he is what I could call an anti-reductionist. And I'll get into a little bit more of what that means. But keep in mind, when Prichard is going after the clarification of a term, he wants to clarify it, not explain it in terms of something else. So he's anti-reductionist. To reduce something is to basically, move it from where it is and to explain it in terms of other things, to reduce it down. Prichard has a strong anti-reductionist line in his thinking, and this crops up in a variety of his works. Although he wrote a fair amount, he did not publish that much, and there's a story to that, but that gets into more of the history of publishing at these universities in the early 20th century. I'll put that aside. But one book that he published one book, and it was a book on Kant. And I would also refer to you for more background on Prichard. You could look at Jonathan Dancy's article in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's quite a good work. Anyway, so back to his work on Prichard's work on Kant. What he argues in this, and it's quite a critical work of Kant. What Prichard wants to argue is that knowledge, and we'll see this same kind of thinking with respect to obligation, the concept of knowledge, the concept of obligation. For Prichard, in his criticisms of Kant, he wants to say that knowledge is sui generis, which just means knowledge is a unique thing. Here's the anti-reductionist theme coming in. If something is sui generis, it's unique, you can't explain it in terms of other things. You can try to characterize, you can try to clarify, but you don't explain it in terms of other things. If you do, you're making a fundamental mistake. You're employing some kind of reductionism where it's not legitimate. So yeah, you can try it, you can do it, but you're making fundamental error when you do that. So Prichard will also argue that ethics, like the philosophy of mathematics too, should not be a reductionist enterprise. Again, we're going to look at his notion of ethical obligation. So for Prichard, something like knowledge is sui generis, and so is ethical obligation. You shouldn't be trying to explain them by reducing them to other things. So Prichard's main point is that the traditional approach to ethics, the traditional approach is a reductionist one. It's trying to explain ethics in terms of other things. He thinks that's an illegitimate project. And that's what he's after in his work, Does Moral Philosophy Rest on a Mistake? Well, it's a rhetorical title. The answer is yes, it does. And so Prichard's going to give a fairly trenchant analysis of what he thinks the history has done and the errors that have been committed. So for Prichard, you can think of it this way. This anti-reductionist really is saying that there are primitives in the world, like primitive concepts. It's nothing mystical or strange here. There's just primitive notions or concepts that you can't reduce them or explain them in terms of other things. You can't, sometimes the concepts are too broad and too wide, like being or whatever, that you can't explain them in terms of other things, or they could be way too narrow, something like a particular taste of coffee or something. So lots of concepts will resist this reductionism, that is to explain them in terms of other things, but that doesn't make them mystical in any way. They're just fundamentally something we encounter in our experience. So Prichard, again, like Ross, they have a kind of intuitionism. But this notion of their intuition is, don't let it become something mystical or think of it as something kind of esoteric. It's nothing like that. And I'll get into more of the details of how that works. Now, Prichard was also influenced by a number of other thinkers that came before him. He was interested and taught by a fellow named Cook Wilson, and Cook Wilson gave him a theme that's common is that in the philosophy of mathematics is that the true notion, right, sort of true notions, they have a uniqueness to them, and they're presented uniquely to the mind. In other words, they're presented cleanly to the mind. Now, again, this sounds much more mystical than it really is that the objects, say, of mathematics have a Platonic flavor to them. And what's that really saying? Well, these true objects of knowledge, these true notions or concepts, they're presented in a way that the mind plays almost no role in their presentation. The mind is like a passive receptor. Right? So in other words, you can think of it this way. The less that the mind does in the perception of something, the more objective, neutral the perception is. So this ideal limit is that the mind pretty well doesn't do anything. It's just an openness towards these concepts, just something that's directly experienced or something that's directly given, and it's not shaped or influenced by the mind. Well, those things you can't really describe in any way. They're just a kind of given. And in that sense, this sounds very mystical, but it's actually quite prosaic. We sometimes talk of it as an intuition or a pure seeing. And this, of course, people will think, oh, it's kind of some sort of mystical insight, but not really. Well, again, as I said, we'll look at this in a little bit more detail. So think of it this way. If the more that the mind plays a role in the object presentation, the more that the mind is influencing, the less objective, and you're not really getting knowledge out of the deal. It's some kind of mental perception or projections is perhaps a better way to put it. Now, this idea that the true notions, the primitives, have to be this directly given, and that the mind plays virtually no role, and that knowledge is really stuff that's given. It's not something that can be corrected. Like if you know something, it's a truth, and you can't be wrong about it if you know it in the true sense of the word. This very stringent, strict definition of knowledge is common in many philosophers in the Western tradition of philosophy. You can find it all the way back in Plato in the Theaetetus. He stresses what knowledge is, and Socrates offers this basic idea of what knowledge is to shape and the discussion to flesh out the idea of knowledge, but he offers that knowledge has to be something exact and it can't be reduced or talked about in terms of anything else. That's quite important to Prichard. And as we'll see, it leads him to this big critique of the history of ethics. So knowledge of obligation has to be clean and clear, just like the way the philosopher leaves the cave in the Republic and comes to this direct encounter with the good. So it's got a Platonic feel to it, escaping the body and all these kinds of things. Again, don't get too carried away about that feel. It's not supposed to be mysticism. So how many things appear like this? These primitives and all these things? Not really that many, right? But important ones do, like the concept of knowledge, concept of ethical obligation. So this notion of a pure appearance is important. So this kind of intuition plays a key role. And as I said, Prichard was acknowledged by W.D. Ross, and a number of other philosophers also acknowledged, like John Austin, for instance, the great linguistic philosopher, speak jacks and things like that. He was an undergraduate. He was taught by Prichard and said, Prichard was one of the finest thinkers of his generation. Another was C.D. Broad, was another thinker of the time, who said that Prichard was he called him the G.E. Moore, sort of a G.E. Moore-like figure, and G.E. Moore is like a huge figure in philosophy, ethics in the 20th century. And there's also a nice little anecdote. You can find it in more detail in Dancy's Stanford Encyclopedia article of Prichard had an encounter with none other than Ludwig Wittgenstein, the great philosopher, like one of the most, some people argue, was the greatest philosopher of the 20th century. That perhaps could be true, but in any case, you can make that case in a reasonable way, although some may disagree with it. But Prichard was engaged in discussions with Wittgenstein, and he pronounced Wittgenstein as Wittgenstein, and kept calling him that in this little conversation that they had at one of the conversation groups. And legend has it that Wittgenstein snapped at him and supposedly put him in his place. And to this day, it's a bit of a debate an amusing one as to whether or not Prichard was really put in his place or was just said something, or, Wittgenstein was just rude to him. So we can debate about what the encounter really was. But what we don't need to debate about is the importance that I want to stress of Prichard's place. So this idea of getting clarity in the fundamental concepts, which he inherits from mathematics, and getting clarity now of the primitives, but in this one, it's going to be the notion of moral or ethical obligation. Right? What exactly does that truly mean? Because once you analyze this, once you really get into analyzing this, Prichard says the answer to the question, does moral philosophy rest on a mistake, will be given. And the answer will be, yeah, it rests on a mistake because it has not become clear enough about this concept of a moral obligation. So how does he do this? Stay tuned for the next lecture.